It was a beautiful sunny afternoon, the perfect day for a wedding. The air was filled with excitement, and the sound of soft music played in the background. Thomas, the groom, stood at the altar with a proud smile on his face. He wore a sharp, expensive suit, and his eyes sparkled with anticipation. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. His bride, Julia, stood beside him, her heart racing. She was a beautiful woman, dressed in a white gown that shimmered in the sunlight. Her eyes shone with joy, but there was a hint of nervousness in her smile. She glanced around the room filled with guests, making sure everything was perfect. It was the wedding of her dreams, but there was something on her mind that made her uneasy. The couple had planned every detail of the wedding, from the elegant decorations to the luxurious food. There was just one thing that Julia hadn't planned for: her groom's behavior. Thomas had been acting strangely ever since the morning of the wedding. He seemed tense and distant, as if something was bothering him. But Julia didn't want to ruin the mood by bringing it up. She pushed her worries aside and focused on the celebration. As the ceremony began, Thomas's family and friends gathered around the couple, many of them whispering to each other in excitement. It was a grand affair, with guests dressed in their finest clothes, their laughter echoing across the room. The wedding was the talk of the town, and it was clear that everyone expected it to be a spectacular event. However, among the guests was a man named Xavier. He wasn't someone most of the people at the wedding knew very well, but to Julia, he was someone she admired. Xavier was a well-dressed, quiet man with a calm demeanor, and he had always been kind to her. What most people didn't know was that Xavier was one of the most successful business tycoons in the city, though he kept this part of his life hidden. Xavier had been invited to the wedding as a close friend of Julia's family. He had always been respectful, and even though he was much wealthier than most of the other guests, he never boasted about it. His presence at the wedding was nothing out of the ordinary, and he was blending in with the other guests as they enjoyed the evening. As Julia smiled and danced with her friends, she caught a glimpse of Thomas talking to his friends at the far side of the room. She could see the tension in his face, but she didn't know why. Something was off, but Julia couldn't place it. She hoped that it was just pre-wedding nerves. After all, everything was going perfectly, or so it seemed. But as the night wore on, little did Julia know, something was about to happen that would change the course of her wedding day forever. As the evening moved forward, the wedding reception was in full swing. The guests mingled, laughing and chatting, enjoying the delicious food and drinks. The music played softly in the background, and the mood was light. But in the midst of all the celebration, a strange feeling began to take over the atmosphere. Thomas had been acting more distant as the night went on. He stood near the edge of the room, talking quietly with a few of his friends. His eyes darted across the room, scanning the guests, and his face grew more and more tense. Julia noticed this, but she didn't want to draw attention to it. She smiled, pretending everything was fine, as she continued to enjoy her time with friends. At some point, however, a small group of guests began to notice that something was missing. One of Thomas's family heirlooms, a small but valuable piece of jewelry, had disappeared. The item was something of great sentimental value to the family, and it had been a centerpiece on the gift table. A sudden wave of panic spread among the guests. The music seemed to slow, and whispers filled the air. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he looked around the room, and his face turned red with anger. He marched toward the center of the room, calling for attention. "Someone has taken it," he said loudly, his voice filled with frustration. "The jewelry is gone." The guests paused, unsure of how to react. They looked at each other, confused and shocked by the sudden accusation. But Thomas's eyes quickly fell on Xavier, standing quietly across the room. Without hesitation, Thomas pointed at him and shouted, You must be the one who took it." Xavier, who had been standing calmly, looked up in surprise. His calm expression didn't change, but there was a glimmer of confusion in his eyes. He had no idea what Thomas was talking about. "What are you accusing me of?" Xavier asked, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't taken anything." But Thomas wasn't listening. He was fuming with anger, his face twisted in disbelief. "I've been watching you," Thomas said, his voice growing louder. "You're the only one who doesn't belong here. You must have stolen it." The room went silent. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to handle the situation. Julia's heart sank as she watched the scene unfold before her. She had never seen Thomas act like this before. She knew he had his opinions, but this was something else. His accusations seemed unfounded and rash. Xavier stood still, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to Thomas's outburst. He didn't defend himself right away. Instead, he waited for a moment, as if processing what had just happened. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke again. "I don't know what you're talking about, Thomas," Xavier said, still calm. "But I suggest you be careful with your words." The tension in the room was thick, and Julia's hands began to shake. She looked from Thomas to Xavier, feeling caught between the two. She couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't the wedding she had imagined. It wasn't the day she had dreamed of. Little did Thomas know, the man he had just accused was someone he could never have expected, a man whose business empire spanned the city and beyond. But Xavier wasn't here to boast or make his presence known. He was just a guest, quietly enjoying the celebration, and now he was being blamed for something he hadn't done. The guests stood in stunned silence, waiting for what would happen next. The room was filled with silence after Thomas's accusation. Every eye was on Xavier, waiting to see how he would react to the public accusation. The tension was almost unbearable. Thomas stood there, glaring at him, his face red with anger, while Xavier remained calm and composed, his expression unreadable. Julia stood frozen in place. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Thomas had just accused someone of stealing, and it wasn't just anyone. It was Xavier, the kind, quiet man who had always been so respectful. How could Thomas, of all people, make such a serious claim without any proof? It felt so wrong. Xavier, though surprised by the accusation, didn't panic. He had faced challenges in his life before, but this was different. His calmness only seemed to make Thomas more agitated. Xavier took a deep breath, looking directly at Thomas, his voice steady as he spoke. "Thomas, I don't know why you think I would take anything, but I can assure you I haven't," Xavier said, his voice calm but firm. Thomas wasn't ready to back down. He shook his head, looking at Xavier as though he didn't believe a word he was saying. "You're lying. You've been acting strange all evening. I saw you eyeing the jewelry earlier. You must have taken it." His voice was rising with each word, and his eyes narrowed in anger. The guests watched in shock as the groom, the one everyone had come to celebrate, became more and more aggressive. The wedding reception that was supposed to be joyful and lighthearted had turned into an uncomfortable scene. No one knew what to do. Most of them had never seen Thomas act this way before. He was always so composed, always in control. But now, in his fury, he seemed like a different person. Xavier didn't shout or argue. He just looked at Thomas with calm eyes. He knew that getting angry wouldn't help, so he simply stood his ground. "I understand you're upset, but accusing someone without evidence is wrong," Xavier said softly, his tone still respectful. "I don't know what happened to your jewelry, but I didn't take it." The guests murmured among themselves, some starting to question Thomas's actions. Why had he jumped to such an extreme conclusion? Why accuse someone who had been nothing but kind to everyone? It was hard to ignore that the situation seemed strange, especially given that Xavier had no reason to steal. Julia, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt her heart sink further. She didn't know what was going on in Thomas's mind, but she knew this wasn't just a small mistake. It was a major issue that couldn't be brushed aside. She had always known that Thomas had certain beliefs, but this felt different. This was something deeper, something that made her uncomfortable. She glanced at Xavier, who stood there, still calm despite the accusations. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she could see the sadness in them. He wasn't angry, he was just disappointed. Disappointed by the way Thomas had treated him, and more importantly, by the way Thomas was handling the situation. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed unwilling to let it go. His eyes darted around the room, seeking support from his friends. He was trying to convince everyone that he was right, but the more he spoke, the more the guests began to doubt him. The room was filled with tension, and the air seemed thick with anticipation. What would happen next? Would Thomas apologize and make things right? Or would this incident ruin what was supposed to be the happiest day of Julia's life? The tension in the room was undeniable. Julia stood quietly, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. The wedding that had started out so beautifully had taken a sudden, uncomfortable turn. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening, but all she could think about was how awkward and strange everything had become. Julia's family, standing near the front of the room, exchanged uneasy glances. Her parents, who had spent months helping with the wedding planning, now seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. They had known Thomas for years, but seeing him act like this made them question everything they had believed about him. Her mother, a kind woman with a gentle smile, whispered something to her father, but it was hard to make out the words. Her father, usually calm and collected, looked visibly uncomfortable. He had always respected Thomas, but now he was starting to feel uneasy about the way he was treating their guest, Xavier. Thomas's family, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice the discomfort in the room. They were still standing with him, offering their support, but their support felt more like silence than anything else. They didn't speak up to defend Xavier or challenge Thomas's accusations. It was as though they were too caught up in their own pride to see the truth of the situation. Julia's heart sank as she looked around the room. The guests had grown quiet, many of them too nervous to speak up. It wasn't clear whether they were afraid to upset Thomas or if they were simply unsure of what to do. But the longer the silence stretched, the more Julia felt like something had gone terribly wrong. Her eyes returned to Xavier, who stood motionless in the center of the room. He hadn't reacted with anger or frustration. Instead, he was calm, too calm for the situation. His eyes were fixed on Thomas, but there was no hatred in them, just a quiet sadness. Julia finally gathered the courage to step forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Thomas," she began, her words soft but firm, "this isn't like you. You can't just accuse someone without proof." Thomas turned to her quickly, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "But Julia, I know what I saw. I've been watching him all evening. He's the only one who could have taken it." Her heart skipped a beat. "You don't know that," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "Xavier has been nothing but kind to all of us. He doesn't deserve this." Thomas's expression hardened, and for a moment, Julia wondered if he even heard her. He seemed so focused on his own feelings of frustration that it was as though he couldn't hear anything else. But then Julia saw something in his eyes. It wasn't anger, nor was it a realization. It was something deeper, a hint of pride, mixed with embarrassment. Thomas wasn't just upset that the jewelry was gone. He was upset that he had lost control of the situation. He had misjudged someone, and his ego couldn't handle it. As Julia's words sank in, she noticed a few of the other guests starting to speak softly to each other. Some were beginning to share quiet murmurs of disapproval. Others exchanged concerned looks, their expressions revealing their own doubts about Thomas's behavior. Xavier, standing near the back of the room, finally spoke again. His voice, calm and steady, broke through the tension. "It's okay, Julia. I understand," he said, his words reassuring. "I don't want this to be your problem. I'll leave." But Julia couldn't let that happen. She turned to Xavier, her heart aching as she realized the gravity of what was going on. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You don't have to leave." She looked at Thomas, whose gaze was now focused on the floor. It was clear to Julia that there was more at play here than just a missing piece of jewelry. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about deeper issues, things that Julia hadn't fully understood about Thomas. Her heart was torn. The man she was about to marry had just treated someone with disrespect. And for what? His own pride and his own narrow view of the world. Julia wasn't sure what to do, but she knew she couldn't just ignore what was happening. As the tension in the room grew thicker, the guests were starting to feel uncomfortable. The earlier excitement of the wedding had quickly faded, replaced by confusion and unease. Julia stood at the center of it all, her heart heavy with worry. She couldn't believe how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Xavier, still standing calmly at the back of the room, seemed unaffected by the growing drama. His posture was relaxed, and his eyes remained calm, though it was clear he was becoming increasingly disappointed by the events unfolding. He had not expected his quiet presence to cause such a scene. But just as the silence was becoming unbearable, one of the guests, a well-dressed man who had been standing in the corner, stepped forward. He had been quietly watching the drama unfold, but now his voice broke the tension. "Excuse me, everyone," the man said, his voice carrying across the room. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Everyone turned to look at him, and the room fell silent. The man was a familiar face to some. He worked in the city's business world. He had met Xavier a few times at events, though he had never really known him personally. The man glanced at Xavier, then back at Thomas. "I think there's something you should know about Xavier," he continued, his voice steady. "Xavier here isn't just a guest. He's actually one of the most successful business tycoons in the city." There was a collective gasp from the crowd. It was clear that no one had expected this. The whispers spread quickly through the room, with some guests exchanging confused looks, while others seemed to grasp the significance of what the man had just revealed. Thomas's eyes widened, and for the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. He looked from the man to Xavier, then back again. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little quieter now, though still tinged with disbelief. The man smiled politely, though his expression was tinged with discomfort at the situation. "Xavier is the owner of several large companies in the city. He's involved in everything from real estate to technology, and his investments are known around the world." Xavier, still standing quietly, gave a small nod. He didn't seek the attention, but now that the truth was out, there was no point in hiding it. His business empire, though vast, was not something he flaunted. He had always preferred to stay under the radar, keeping his personal life separate from his work. Julia's eyes went wide as she looked at Xavier. She had no idea. She had known him for a long time, but she never realized how influential he truly was. To her, he had always been a kind and humble man, someone who didn't care for the spotlight. And now, everyone around her seemed to realize just how important he was. Thomas stood frozen, his mouth slightly open in shock. His earlier anger and accusations seemed foolish now, and a wave of embarrassment washed over him. He had made a snap judgment, based on his own assumptions, and now the truth was staring him in the face. For a moment, no one said anything. The guests were still processing the information. Some of them had heard rumors about Xavier, but had never known the full extent of his success. Others were simply stunned by how wrong Thomas had been. Finally, Julia, who had been watching this all unfold, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight of disappointment. "Thomas," she said, looking him directly in the eyes, "how could you accuse someone like this without knowing who they really are? You've let your anger and pride get in the way of what's right." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of the guests who were now watching him with judgment in their eyes. He realized, too late, that his actions had ruined the night. Xavier, noticing the growing discomfort around him, simply shook his head. "It's all right, Julia," he said softly. "I don't want to cause any more trouble. I'll leave." But Julia wouldn't let him go. She turned to Xavier and said firmly, "No, you're not leaving." This is not your fault." The guests stood in silence, watching the drama unfold. But now it seemed clear that something much deeper than a missing piece of jewelry was at play. The tension was far from over, and Julia knew she had a decision to make. What would happen next? The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence after Xavier's true identity was revealed. Guests exchanged glances, unsure of what to do or say. Julia stood at the center of it all, torn between the man she was about to marry and the man who had just been wrongfully accused. Thomas's face was a mix of shock and embarrassment. His earlier outburst had revealed his worst side to everyone. And now, as he stood there in front of the guests, he felt the weight of his actions. It wasn't just the missing jewelry that had caused the problem. It was his pride, his quick judgment, and his willingness to accuse someone based on nothing but assumptions. Xavier, still calm despite the tension, stood by quietly. He wasn't angry, but the disappointment in his eyes was clear. He hadn't wanted to be part of the drama. He had only come to the wedding as a guest, to support Julia and her family. But now, his quiet presence had been turned into the center of attention. Julia couldn't help but feel torn. On one hand, there was Thomas, the man she was about to marry. She had loved him for years, or so she had thought. But on the other hand, there was Xavier, a man who had shown nothing but kindness, who had been accused of something he didn't do and had handled the situation with grace. The weight of the moment felt heavy on Julia's shoulders. She had always believed in standing by the people she loved, but now she was faced with a difficult decision. Was Thomas the man she thought he was? Was he the man she wanted to spend her life with, especially after seeing how he had treated someone so unfairly? Julia took a deep breath and glanced at Xavier. His quiet strength gave her a sense of clarity, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She turned to Thomas, her voice calm but firm. "Thomas," she began, "I can't ignore what just happened. You accused Xavier without any proof, and you let your pride and anger get in the way of what's right. That's not the person I thought you were." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but Julia held up her hand, signaling for him to listen. "I've always believed in doing what's right, and right now, I can't stand by someone who would act this way. It's not just about the jewelry, it's about respect and trust." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Julia looked around the room at the guests, who were now watching her closely. They had all seen what had happened, and they could see the pain in her eyes. This wasn't just about a mistake, it was about her future. Thomas stood there, his face red with shame. He looked like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. His pride was too strong, and he couldn't bring himself to apologize, not in front of everyone. He had expected the night to be perfect, but now, everything was falling apart. Julia felt a pang of sadness. She had hoped for a happy future with Thomas, but now she realized that the man she was about to marry wasn't the man she had thought he was. His actions had revealed something much deeper, something that could not be ignored. Xavier, seeing the pain in Julia's eyes, stepped forward. "Julia," he said softly, "you don't have to do this for me. I don't want to cause you any more stress. If you need space, I'll leave." Julia shook her head, her heart heavy but resolute. "No, Xavier, you're not the problem here. It's Thomas. I need to think about what's best for me, for my future." The guests were silent, waiting for Julia's next move. She had made her choice, but the weight of it still hung in the air. She couldn't ignore what had happened. She couldn't ignore the way Thomas had treated someone so unfairly. And so, with a heavy heart, she made the hardest decision of her life. "I can't marry you, Thomas," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The room was still. It felt like time had stopped. Julia looked at Thomas one last time, searching for any sign of the man she had once known. But there was nothing. She knew, deep down, that this was the right decision, no matter how painful it was. The words Julia had just spoken hung in the air like a thick cloud, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The room, filled with so many people just moments ago, seemed to shrink in that quiet, uncomfortable space. Thomas stood frozen, his face flushed red with embarrassment. He hadn't expected things to turn out this way, especially not in front of so many people. His world, which had seemed so sure and perfect just hours before, was crumbling right in front of him. Julia's words were still ringing in his ears. "I can't marry you, Thomas." She had said it so quietly, but her words were like thunder to him. He had never imagined hearing them. Not once had he thought that his behavior could push her away, but now, the reality of it hit him hard. Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He had so many things he wanted to say. He wanted to explain himself, to apologize, to tell Julia that he hadn't meant for things to go this far. But in that moment, the words didn't come. How could he possibly explain himself when he had been so wrong? The guests stood in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Some were uncomfortable, while others exchanged looks that suggested they too were beginning to question Thomas's actions. Julia, standing firm and resolute, had already made her decision. She wasn't going to back down, no matter how much Thomas tried to salvage the situation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Thomas took a deep breath. His gaze shifted to the floor, and then slowly he looked back at Julia. There was a look in his eyes now, one that had been absent before. It wasn't anger or frustration anymore. It was something else. It was regret. He could see the hurt in Julia's eyes, and it was clear that his actions had hurt her more than he had realized. "I'm sorry, Julia," Thomas said quietly, his voice shaky. "I don't know what came over me. I was angry, and I made a mistake. I shouldn't have accused Xavier like that. It was wrong, and I know it." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I let my pride get in the way, and I see now how badly I've messed up." Julia looked at him, her expression still serious but softening slightly. She had always believed that Thomas could do better, that he had a kind heart beneath the arrogance and the pride. But this was different. This wasn't just a small mistake. This was a betrayal of trust. It wasn't something that could be easily fixed with an apology. "I appreciate that you're sorry," Julia replied, her voice calm but firm. "But it's more than just a simple apology, Thomas. You've shown me a side of you that I didn't know existed, a side that I'm not sure I can live with. You let your assumptions rule your actions, and you hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and I don't know if I can move past that." Thomas's shoulders slumped as he absorbed her words. He had never seen Julia this way. She wasn't angry, but there was a quiet strength in her that he had never fully appreciated before. The way she stood up for what was right, even when it meant confronting him, was something he couldn't ignore. "I understand," Thomas said softly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't expect you to change your mind. I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry for what I've done. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person, if you'll ever give me the chance." Julia took a deep breath, looking at Thomas for a long moment. She could see that he was genuinely sorry, but at the same time, she knew that his actions had shown her a side of him that she couldn't ignore. The man she thought she was going to marry wasn't the man she had hoped for. "I wish you the best, Thomas," she said quietly, "but I can't marry you. Not after this." With that, she turned to Xavier, who had been standing silently through it all. He had remained calm and respectful, not demanding anything, just quietly waiting for the storm to pass. Julia gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for everything, Xavier," she said. "I'm so sorry you had to be part of this." Xavier smiled gently in return. "It's okay, Julia. I'm just glad everything is being set right." The room was still filled with a heavy silence after Julia made her decision. Thomas stood at the center of it all, his head bowed in shame, while Julia quietly turned away. Xavier, who had been the calm in the storm, now stepped forward, his quiet strength offering a sense of peace amidst the tension. The guests slowly began to murmur, some clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened, while others seemed to understand that Julia had made a difficult but necessary choice. Julia's heart felt heavy as she glanced around the room. She had always dreamed of a perfect wedding, a day to remember with joy. But now, it felt like that dream had slipped through her fingers. The weight of her decision settled on her shoulders. It wasn't easy to walk away from someone she had loved for so long, but she knew deep down it was the right thing to do. Trust was something that couldn't be easily mended after it had been broken. Xavier, seeing the sadness in her eyes, gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did what you needed to do," he said softly. "It's not easy, but sometimes doing what's right isn't." Julia gave him a grateful smile, appreciating his kindness. She wasn't sure what to do next, but she knew she needed some time to think and process everything. Her mind kept going back to the moment when Thomas had accused Xavier, how quickly he had judged him, how he had let his anger and pride cloud his judgment. That wasn't the person Julia had believed Thomas to be. As she stood there, lost in thought, Julia's mother stepped forward. Her face was filled with both concern and understanding. "Julia," she said gently, "I know this isn't how you imagined today going, but we're here for you, no matter what. We always will be." Her father, who had been standing quietly by her side, nodded. "We support you," he added. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. You made the choice that was right for you." Julia's heart swelled with gratitude. Her parents had always been her rock, and their support now, in this difficult moment, meant more than anything. It was a reminder that, no matter what happened, she wasn't alone. Thomas, meanwhile, stood off to the side, still processing everything. He had watched Julia walk away from him, and it felt like a sharp pain in his chest. His pride had kept him from apologizing properly, from truly understanding the depth of his mistake. But now, standing alone, he realized the weight of what he had lost. He had been so caught up in his own emotions, so focused on his image and his expectations, that he had ignored the things that truly mattered: respect, trust, and kindness. And now, he had driven Julia away. Xavier, noticing Thomas's struggle, spoke up. "She made a difficult decision," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to understand that what you did wasn't just an accusation. It was a reflection of how you view people. You judged based on assumptions, and that's not something anyone can forgive easily." Thomas looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I know," he said quietly. "I've messed up, and I don't know how to fix it. But I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes to become a better person." Xavier nodded. "It's a start, but sometimes things can't be fixed just because you want them to be. You'll need to prove yourself." The guests began to quietly leave, murmuring to each other as they filtered out of the room. The wedding, which had started as a celebration, had now turned into a painful reminder of what had been lost. Julia stood quietly, looking out the window, her mind racing with thoughts. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had made the right choice. She wasn't just walking away from a man she had once loved. She was walking towards her own future, one where she could live with integrity and respect for herself and those around her. As the last of the guests left, Julia took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it. She had made her decision, and she would move forward with her head held high. The days that followed were difficult for Julia, but she knew that in time, the pain would fade. She had made a hard choice, and though it had torn her apart, she also felt a sense of relief. Her decision had been driven by the need for honesty and respect, both for herself and the people around her. It wasn't easy, but she knew she was taking the first step toward a future where she could truly be herself. Julia spent time with her family, leaning on their support and love. They understood her better than anyone, and their comforting words made the transition a little easier. Julia realized how important it was to surround herself with people who cared about her well-being, not just people who were easy to be around. In their presence, she felt safe. Her thoughts also often drifted back to Xavier. Since the wedding, he had been kind, offering her space, but always ready to listen if she needed someone to talk to. He had never pushed her for anything, just quietly supported her decision, which made her respect him even more. She realized that he was exactly the type of person she wanted in her life, someone who treated others with fairness and kindness. Xavier's calm presence had helped her see things from a clearer perspective. He had shown her how to remain calm in the face of conflict, how to handle challenges without letting emotions cloud judgment. He was exactly what she needed, not just as a friend but perhaps as someone who could help her rebuild her trust in others. One evening, a few weeks after the wedding, Julia received a message from Xavier. It was simple, just a text asking if she wanted to meet for coffee. She smiled at the message and quickly replied that she would love to. They met at a cozy cafe in the heart of the city, one that Julia had always loved. It was small, with soft lighting and warm, inviting smells of fresh coffee. Xavier was already there when Julia arrived, his usual calm smile on his face. It was comforting to see him again. Julia could feel the weight of the past few weeks begin to lift as she sat down across from him. "How have you been?" Xavier asked, his voice gentle. "I've been okay," Julia replied, taking a deep breath. "It's been a bit of a roller coaster, but I'm finding my feet again. And I've had time to think." Xavier nodded, giving her space to speak. Julia appreciated that. He wasn't rushing her or expecting anything from her. He was simply present, letting her take her time. "I've realized something," Julia continued. "I'm not just moving on from Thomas. I'm moving forward. I'm learning to trust myself again. And that's something I should have been doing all along." Xavier smiled warmly. "I think that's the most important thing. Sometimes we forget how strong we are until we face something difficult." Julia nodded, her heart feeling a little lighter. "You've been so patient with me, Xavier. I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." Xavier's smile grew. "You don't need to thank me, Julia. I'm just glad I could be here for you." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee and enjoying each other's company. It wasn't rushed. There was no pressure. For the first time in a long time, Julia felt like she could just be herself, without fear of judgment or expectation. As they finished their coffee and stood to leave, Xavier turned to her with a thoughtful look. "You're doing well, Julia. Whatever comes next, I know you'll handle it with grace." Julia smiled, feeling the warmth of his words settle in her chest. "Thanks, Xavier. I think I'm ready for whatever comes next too." And as they walked out of the cafe together, Julia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She wasn't just moving on from her past. She was walking into a future full of new possibilities. And with people like Xavier by her side, she knew that she was ready for whatever came her way.